And joining us is the NAACP's Director of Environmental and Climate Justice. I didn't even know they had that. So I'm like, yes, tell us more. Let me welcome the one and only Abre Connor.
Thank you
Welcome.
so much. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about the work that we're doing and how we're advancing environmental and climate justice.
Listen, I was telling you during the break, I've been very critical of all of these institutional organizations because it just feels like, there's so much that they could do that they're not doing. But I'm also mindful that locally and in these spaces like you're in, a lot of things are being done, but that never gets any attention. So I'm like, let me do better. Shout out to Eljoy Williams, the head of the NAACP in Brooklyn, who's part of our family. So I happen to know a few places where it's happening, Florida as well. But tell me, what is the environmental and climate justice? I didn't even know that was a thing. And what do you do as director?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you say that because, the NAACP just from a historical standpoint, has a history in actually coining the term of environmental racism with Ben Chavis. And so there's that connection that we've had and we've understood that we cannot advance civil rights and social justice work without talking about the environment, without talking about climate issues. And we've known that for forever. Our communities have been left out of the conversations. We've been left out of the rooms where the decisions are made, but we're disproportionately impacted by all of the impacts of, greenhouse gas emissions, by, all the toxic pollutants that live within our communities because people are dumping them there in our communities and leaving us to have to figure out how to think of next steps. And so what we really do, especially within our Center for Environmental and Climate Justice, is we really anchor our work within the community. I come from an environmental justice and a civil rights background. And one of the first things that I learned in doing environmental and climate justice work is that work is an inherently local issue. So you cannot actually do that work without talking to the communities. So that's what we're doing. We have individuals that we're talking to across the country and sometimes internationally as well about what environmental and climate justice looks like, so that we can actually advance the work that community members are doing already on the ground so that we can amplify the work that they're doing. We see that, for example, in Jackson, one of the first things that I did before we even got to a place of strategically thinking about our advocacy is meeting with the residents, meeting with our units, meeting with our branch, meeting with our state conference, president, executive director, and president to make sure that we had an understanding of what is actually happening, how can we add value, how can we help to add capacity, and how do we amplify the voices of people, not about taking over, but about amplifying and ensuring that the needs that are needed actually on the ground, that we can add value to that.
I'm always impressed by people like you who do this work because you do it and it's tireless. A lot of times it's thankless. You are tireless, and the work many times is thankless. And getting out into the community and really sitting down and talking with folks about the issues that impact them directly every single day. Well, we read the headlines, example, what's going on in Baltimore right now. So fill us in a little bit with what's happening there, and maybe you can also touch on what's going on in Mississippi. Just give us an update on that.
Well, what we're seeing in Baltimore is, unfortunately, a microcosm of what we're seeing in Black communities across the country. So we have these water infrastructure systems where we haven't been able to have resources poured into our communities. And now the very same people who, as I talked about before, are already facing a disproportionate impact of toxic pollutants, of having bad water quality, are now left to deal with how do we actually pick up the pieces. And so when you have a water system that actually needs to be updated, or potentially you may need a new water system altogether, you're going to start to see more and more of toxins within the water. You're going to see more and more of there being bad water quality, especially when we're thinking about our climate crisis that we're in. So oftentimes whenever there are natural disasters or extreme weather events. So it gets really cold out of season or really hot out of season. That all impacts the quality of the water, and it all impacts the infrastructure within a system as well. And so we know that, for example, in West Baltimore, we're seeing this a lot more. There's a lot more Black folks there as well. But for years, we've seen that there were not federal resources, for example, that were actually being poured into our communities. They were sometimes being given to the state, but if you didn't have people actually at the state level who were actually going to make sure that that money gets funneled, particularly to our communities, then what we end up with is over years and years of there not being intentional investment, that now we're seeing the impact of that. And in Baltimore, what we've seen is that, there is now a focus on having more prioritization of funding, but for a number of years, that was not necessarily the case from a number of different levels. But now we have an EPA administrator and we have a president who stated that environmental justice is a priority for that administration, is a priority for the EPA. We've seen historic investments in the EPA to actually do environmental justice work in the communities. And that, by the way, is also based on the community voice, because community members were saying, hey, you all are getting all this money, but we're not seeing any of it. So how do we actually create a system that allows for us to actually get that money more rapidly? And we don't have to worry about, whether or not you have a state agency or you have a governor who is saying, you know what, we know that West Baltimore actually needs to be prioritized when it comes to infrastructure needs, that the community themselves can reach further up to the federal agencies and to other individuals who have money so that they can start to rebuild themselves.
We're talking with Abre Connor. She is the NAACP Director of Environmental and Climate Justice. And you can follow her at MS for Ms. A for Abre Connor, Conner on the Twitters. Go ahead, Renee.
Karen, when we were all young, we would be out in the streets with the water hose and just drinking straight on out of the hose.
It was delicious.
It was delicious. But what you're telling us is that that's not possible in places like West Baltimore and in Jackson, Mississippi, where we had been talking about that crisis there. And in West Baltimore, I guess there were like 3 cases of E. coli. And these things impact us going forward. We know now, children who get E. coli, I mean, what happens to them? They get, very, very sick, and God forbid that anything worse happen. But it's frustrating that it's not just, the clean water, though. That's the thing. It's like robbing kids of their childhood, the most basic thing, turning on the tap and getting a glass of water. It's basic.
Yeah. Let me ask this. And you're so spot on, Renee. If somebody's living in a place and they have an issue with the water, first of all, how would you know? Right? How do you know it's not just, how do you know when your water's bad? All right. And then once you do know, like we know in Baltimore, Mississippi, Flint, Michigan, Detroit, Newark, unfortunately, probably throughout the country. How does the NAACP get, do we call? Who do we call? Because a lot of us don't even know who to call. So how do we get to you, Ms. Connor?
Well, I'm actually so glad that you brought that up, because that is actually one of the things that we are currently working on right now, is building out the community science component of the environmental and climate justice work. And so we're actually going to be having those conversations within the next few days, actually helping people understand how to use water testing strips in the community. And we're going to be collecting that information and also making it available to the individuals in the community so they can know, okay, well, we've tested our water. This is what this means, to actually help for folks in the community to have more power over their water. Most people probably don't know that their water is actually probably not tested, at all within a year kind of span. Most water testing that happens, it happens kind of sporadically, it happens at random. And it's really, quite frankly, because of a capacity perspective. Oftentimes, like a city is not going to have the capacity to go and do water testing at every single person's house. But what we can do is actually arm ourselves with the understanding of the fact that there are a number of water crises that are happening in our communities, that you probably need to do water testing a little bit more regularly. It's recommended that water testing happens at least once a year, but I can guarantee you that most people, may not have ever tested their water at all. And if they had, it's definitely not yearly. And so what we're looking to do is really build that out. We're having those conversations actually right now to build out that water testing within communities, so people can understand, that they don't have to just listen to what they're told, but that they have ownership over their story as well. And that's really how we're going to get to a place of rebuilding, of all of us coming together, bringing together our anecdotal evidence, like the stories that we've heard for years and years, that we've known, oh, well, my grandma told me that the water wasn't clean, and so my mom didn't drink the water. And then my mom told me that, the water wasn't clean. And so I told my kids that the water wasn't clean. And that's oftentimes how we pass down those stories. And that's really important. And then another component as well is, to your point, the water testing. That's another part of our story, and how we're going to be able to actually mobilize, engage, and ensure that folks have the information they need to make informed decisions about their water.
So we have 30 seconds. Where do people go to connect and get the water testing and all of that?
Well, people can go to naacp.org right now just to get information about the organization. Go to naacp.org/Jackson, where we have a landing page about all the work that we're doing right now to actually build out what it looks like to think about community engagement. So if they go to that page, they can get all the information that they need for next steps.